welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. I'm here with two JFK assassination researchers. They're going to reintroduce themselves. If you didn't catch their last episode about Parkland Hospital, this one will be a little bit strange to you because we're talking about Bethesda, which is where some would say the magic happened, or happens, or whichever past, present, or future context you want to talk about. Gentlemen, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. Sorry for the long intro, but do you guys mind introducing yourselves?
Thank you, Robbie. Thanks for having me back. Appreciate it. Probably people who have watched this before know who I am, but I'm Russell Kent. I'm a trained physiologist. I have a degree in physiology. I started my life in medicine, and then I moved into communication. So I had my own IT company, which was set up to help people understand complex things. And so I've used both of those abilities, if you like, to understand the mass of information that comes in the JFK assassination. I'm the author of JFK Medical Betrayal, which was published 2 years ago now. And like I say, jolly fine to be back on your show. Thank you.
I'm Brad Parker. I am the author of First on the Scene, Dallas, Parkland Hospital Doctors, and the Assassination of John Kennedy. I've focused primarily on the Dallas end of things, although in order to understand Dallas, you have to understand a little bit about the autopsy. But I started researching about 35 years ago. I don't have the background that Russell does, but I was pre-med for 3.5 years in college, so I know a little bit about the A&P part of things.
Clearly, with these episodes we've done so far, I've been trying to make a summarization of a lot of certain areas of the case. And this one will be particularly focused on Bethesda. And I want to ask you guys, what do you guys think is the important part about Bethesda and why people who are interested or new to the assassination should look at it?
Well, the important part of Bethesda is that it's a second hospital that the body was taken to. We have to backpedal a little bit and say that really an autopsy should have been performed in Dallas by law. But for various reasons, the body was taken away from Dallas and taken back to Washington. And then it ended up in what I believe is the wrong hospital. We'll probably come to that, in Washington for its autopsy in Bethesda. The most important thing is that the wounds described in Bethesda are totally different to the wounds described in Parkland. And we have to try and understand why that is.
I believe Bethesda is important for a couple of reasons, not only the reasons that Russell enumerated there, but also in that if you look at the statements of parties who were present at the Bethesda examination, and this is particularly evident in Vince Palomara's book, JFK from Parkland to Bethesda, the Ultimate Kennedy Assassination Compendium, you will see that many of the witnesses at Bethesda describe wounds remarkably like Dallas. So the only people really, there's a couple of others, the only people really who are describing the Warren Commission version of the wound are Himes, Boswell, and Fink.
Now, when it comes to Bethesda Hospital, what was the first thing that attracted you guys, or the red flag that went off in your mind when examining it?
I guess for me, it was the fact that the autopsy team were not forensic pathologists. So the first guys that got their hands on the body were senior pathologists at Bethesda Naval Hospital. But they weren't forensic pathologists, they were anatomical pathologists, which means that they understood about injury and diseases more than they understood about trauma and particularly gunshot wounds. So when they got their hands on the body, they did things that they really shouldn't have done before the only qualified person arrived, Pierre Fink, Dr. Pierre Fink from the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology. By the time he arrived, he couldn't do his job. And I'm sure we're going to get into that. So, and it's like I said at the beginning, that the fact that the wounds are different to those described by the trauma team in Dallas. That's a red flag already.
Boswell and Humes, they were brought in for the procedure at Bethesda, or just the examination of the body at Bethesda Naval Hospital, which we can get into a little bit of background about the hospital as well too. But they had plenty of time during the transfer of the body to order any pathologist or anyone that would be more qualified to be at that surgery room. So there's always just an excuse of like they had to move the body to Bethesda because it was a more qualified hospital. That's always the explain away that I've seen. And it seems like that's not the case. It seems like actually there was probably different and probably a little bit more, I guess, less experienced than maybe some of the people in Dallas that could have actually done a better job at the actual autopsy.
Well, I'm sure Brad will have something more to say on this, but the body, once a decision had been made to take it back to Washington, then it should have been taken to the best facility possible for its autopsy, which would have been the Walter Reed Hospital, which is an army hospital. Now, armies tend to see more gunshot wounds than navies. So they would have had people there who are more experienced with gunshot wounds. And plus, the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology was right there at Walter Reed. So it should have gone to Walter Reed. The fact that it went to Bethesda is a big question. And I'm not sure that we got to the bottom of it. People say that Jackie was given the choice of which hospital it should go to, and she chose a naval hospital because Jack was in the Navy. But I don't believe that. I think that they really should have taken it to the best facility possible.
I'm sorry. Is that really the excuse?
Yeah, that's really the excuse.
If I get shot, don't take me to my dentist because I had a good interaction or a family member who was a dentist. Like, take me to the hospital.
They took him to a place where they could control it.
The reason that Bethesda was chosen was actually, if you listen to the audio tape, and particularly if you read the transcript, because the audio tape from 1963 is a little muddy. Recording technology was not what it is now. During the flight, Dr. Berkeley is on the radio with the White House Situation Room. And during that time, it is decided that he will go to Walter Reed. And then Jackie apparently spoke to Dr. Berkeley, and Dr. Berkeley says negative. Lace, who was that was Jackie Kennedy's Secret Service code name. She's requesting. I believe they used the word requesting. It's been some time since I've looked at it, but I believe it was a request. Was requesting that he go to Bethesda as he was a Navy man. Which you can understand that, but someone should have said to her, "Hey, we understand he was Navy, but AFIP is far more qualified to do this." And I think she would have listened. She was remarkably cool during this whole thing, and she was very open to suggestions. But no one, I think, had the heart to say, "No, we need to go to AFIP."
Issues with Humes, Boswell. Maybe we can describe some of the backgrounds. Like, what was their selection for choosing Humes and Boswell to perform the autopsy at Bethesda? And then also, I guess, I mean, what their actual like degree or certainty or specialization was compared to what should have been brought on. Like, if we were going to examine some of the procedures that would have went at the Army hospital, if a Jack was brought there for the autopsy.
Well, Humes was the director of the laboratories of pathology at Bethesda Naval Hospital. So he was the most senior pathologist at the hospital, but he wasn't the most experienced. He'd probably given up actually cutting into bodies many years before. His job was to run the laboratories and be an HR manager, if you like, for the laboratories. He reviewed some of the pathological reports, but he didn't actually snap on a pair of gloves for years, and he didn't for the rest of his career. And Boswell, of course, was his number two, who, I mean, ditto, really. He didn't do any either. He was not a practicing pathologist at the time. And of course, both of them were forensic pathologists. Neither of them were forensic pathologists. So they had to wait until Fink came along to get the right expertise. As far as what they should have done, Well, we can come on to that later, and certainly there's a proper technical manual, a procedure that they should have followed. But I'll let Brad comment first.
Oh yeah, you had mentioned, I don't recall if it was before or after we hit record, but there was certainly some things that went on prior to Pierre Fink's arrival. And it seems to me that if you've got a couple of guys whose job involves looking through microscopes and administrative duties, and you're waiting on a guy who is a forensic pathologist who is at the forefront of his, I mean, he was one of the leading forensic pathologists in the military at the time. You would wait for that gentleman to arrive, but in fact, they went ahead and got started. So, as Russell summed it up earlier, he was unable to do his job properly because you come in and we're already going, and he didn't see the body as it was on arrival.
So when the body did arrive, do you want to take me through the chain of events, or at least what Boswell or Humes were able to actually do to the body before Fink's arrival? And then were they also aware that Fink was being called in to also assist in the surgery as well too? Or were they just going off, here's the body, start performing an autopsy, and then Fink just kind of showed up in their perspective?
Sure. Well, I mean, they took the body. They say they took the body out of a casket and put it on the autopsy table. And at that time, when they realized it was a gunshot wound, they should have done nothing, hands off, until we get the right people involved. Because there was a large head wound, Humes says that he thought about getting a neuropathologist in, which is why he contacted the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology to ask for a neuropathologist. But the doctor he spoke to there, Dr. Smith, said, well, you probably need a forensic pathologist. He asked him who he would recommend, and he said, well, we've got a guy here who's the head of the ballistics section. His name's Pierre Fink. I'll send him across. So Humes said, sure, send him over. Again, he should have stepped back from the table and just waited. But in the time it took for Fink to get from Walter Reed, which is also in Washington, to Bethesda, they started the procedure, which there's two real procedures. There's the first one is to eviscerate the body. So you do a Y-in section from both shoulders to the breastbone and then down to the pubic area. You open up the body and you start taking organs out and weighing them and inspecting them. That's what an anatomical pathologist would do. He didn't take enough account of any wounding. So pulled all these organs out, then said, well, okay, let's go ahead and get the brain out. So apparently did a craniotomy to take the brain out. All of this before the forensic pathologist arrived. Now, the wounding to the body, as we all know, was in the back, possibly in the throat and in the head. So the two areas where there was gunshot wounding had both been changed by the time the forensic pathologist arrived, because the chest had been opened and the head had been opened. So Fink arrived, an impossible task. He couldn't do his job. I think he arrived, and this is quite something I've noticed. He didn't arrive until about 9:15, with the autopsy starting at 8 o'clock. That's quite a period of time between when it started and when he arrived. And that quote comes from JAMA, by the way, that he arrived at 9:15. It's in one of the JAMA articles. I've got more to say about Fink, but let me give Brad a chance to comment on what they should have done at first.
Real quick, just before we hop into, because it can already sound pretty super conspiratorial now, but could it have been something of information wasn't relayed properly to these not forensic pathologists, but to these pathologists? Just like they're already thinking, well, this is the second technical autopsy, and they might have not had the full information that the body was taken from Parkland Hospital and brought to Bethesda for an actual autopsy. So they might be like, well, these wounds have probably already been addressed, and they just started opening and cutting and doing things that they shouldn't have been doing because that information was never relayed to them. I'm not trying to dumb down the conspiracy at all. We will get into that, but I do think a lot of these, it's very easy to, if you're going to have an orchestrated conspiracy or something, just have a couple people at the top and just start putting people in places where they're willing accomplices. Not in the sense that they know the actual scheme, but they just start performing and doing their duties like they're supposed to be doing, or like maybe there's some errors in some of their ways. But they just didn't know the full thing that was going on. All information wasn't being relayed to them. They were given a task and they decided to perform at the task. Whether they should have waited or not is different. But
I mean, it's possible, but they had a guy there, Dr. Galloway, Admiral Galloway, who'd come from Parkland where JFK had been treated. And they could just turn to him and say what was done before he arrived here. And it was a simple task, I would have thought.
they didn't do it.
No.
Lazies. That's what I'm talking about. Lazy people.
I've always been intrigued by, and William Law has done a lot of work on this area, is the FBI report by Cyber and O'Neill, surgery of the head area. And FBI agents, as a former law enforcement officer, you don't write that down on your own volition. You wait until somebody qualified, like one of the doctors, and those FBI agents had no idea what these guys' credentials were. They would have just said, "Oh, he's a doctor. He said surgery of the head area. Let's write that down." So I've always been intrigued by that. And Galloway, for instance, Admiral Berkeley, for instance, Godfrey McHugh, for instance, they would have been able to perhaps address that had that question been put to them. But in my research, I've never found that anyone put that question to them.
That also goes with the casket game as well too, because apparently, allegedly, that there was what, 3 caskets that were dropped off at Bethesda, all at different timing, and we all know that Kennedy was only in one of those caskets. Now, whether you want to say that was a distraction just in case there was press or if there was whatever, there's also the missing ambulance for 45 minutes or so that couldn't have been found. But from what I've understood is that when they opened up the casket with the body inside, Kennedy was in there butt naked with his head wrapped. And then when they started unraveling the bandages on Kennedy's head, there was obviously some issues with the skull, which we can get into in a little bit. But I'm just curious from the obviously with the whole Bethesda incident, you mentioned already, Russell, about the distortion of the wounds, about operating without proper, just waiting for someone down there who actually had the proper credentials. Does Fink have the proper credentials? Because he hadn't performed an autopsy in what, like 2 years or 14 months or something like that?
Yeah. Um, I think what a lot of people don't realize is quite how inexperienced Fink was. Now, he was the only qualified forensic pathologist on the team, but he'd only qualified 2 years previously. And at that time, he was made head of the ballistics section at the AFIP, and he essentially drove a desk from then on. He reviewed other people's autopsy reports rather than doing autopsies himself. So he was qualified, but there's no evidence he did any autopsies between 1961 and 1963 when he was a qualified forensic pathologist. Now, if you read the Warren Commission evidence, he said that his most pertinent experience was in Frankfurt in the 1950s when he autopsied 200 bodies. You have to really think carefully about what that means. 200 bodies when he was an army pathologist. He wasn't a forensic pathologist at that time. Most of those bodies would have died from disease or accident. Very few of them would have died from gunshot wounds. I lived in Germany for 5 years, and I never heard of anybody on an army base getting injured by a gunshot wound. And I lived right next to the largest one in Germany. So I think it's possible that it was 2 or 3 gunshot wound injuries that he did an autopsy on while he was in Germany when he was not a qualified forensic pathologist. So the guy on paper looks qualified, but he was very inexperienced. And anyway, when he arrived, he couldn't apply any of that experience because the wounds had been changed.
And as Cyril Wecht pointed out, within a reasonable distance of Washington, there were any number of people whose, bread butter, so to speak, and it's probably a poor choice of words, but that was doing violent autopsies. I mean, not violent as in during the procedure, but people who had died of violence, that would have been, whether they be civilian or military. There were other people far more qualified than any of these three. I believe there was a Dr. Cairn present who actually his credentials surpassed any of the three, but he was basically a spectator. I think maybe he helped with a couple little things, but it was minimal. But there were plenty of people that certainly would have been far more qualified. But the issue is, are they military? Because, and this goes back to them starting early, I tend to think that even though whoever the people in command in that autopsy room were, they went ahead. They knew that Pierre Fink was on the way, and they said, okay, that's fine. Go ahead and get started. I don't know that Humes and Boswell would have started on their own had they not been told to do so. So if you have a civilian pathologist come in, he's not going to be controllable. I mean, he may do what he's told it out of purely being intimidated, but they have no leverage like you would have over military personnel.
Yeah, I think, Brad, you put your finger on this. They were military. All three of them were military, so they could be ordered under threat of court martial. And the second thing is they were all senior military, very senior, right at the top of their game, if you ask about Humes. So he had a huge pension to protect. So these guys could be manipulated.
I think Humes was not too far off from retirement. If I'm not mistaken, it was only by either a year or a couple of months or so. It was supposed to be planned on retiring.
He actually went on to do some other work in Detroit, but when he left the Navy. But I mean, he retired from the Navy shortly afterwards. That's true.
I have to ask about the distortion of the head wound. When did they notice that there was this pre-surgery or there was something going on with the skull? That was obviously would be a red flag if you're really examining it, but was just something that was different or distorted.
Well, for me, it was the incisions on the head. So if you read the autopsy report, they talk about some 4 incisions on the head. An incision sounds like a surgical procedure. And certainly one of the things that I've noted is that an incision would need to be done on the head to begin a craniotomy. So that is a bit of a red flag and is a possible reason why Siebert and O'Neill reported surgery to the head. But there were other things done to the head before the body left Parkland anyway, because they put some pressure pads in the wound that they saw at Parkland. So I'm not sure whether you could describe that as a surgical procedure, but it was an intervention of sorts. I'll leave Brad to pick up on that if he's got something to add there.
Well, yeah, the pressure bandages that were placed, I mean, they were trying to, for all they knew, the casket that had been obtained from O'Neill Funeral Home in Dallas was going to be the casket that the president was buried in. So their goal, which is why it was wrapped in plastic as well, they were trying to keep it from seeping into the interior lining of the casket. So pressure bandages, I really doubt, but this is purely speculation, but I really doubt that Humes and Boswell would have looked at pressure bandages and said surgery on the head area. I'm inclined to think that possibly the reason that was stated were the 4 incisions mentioned by Russell. And also there's one photograph of something inside the head that appears to be metal, kind of a T-shaped thing. And I don't know if that was placed by the folks at Bethesda to hold something in place for the photo. I'm pretty sure it didn't come from Dallas. In Dallas, once he was pronounced, they, the physicians left. The nurses stayed and kind of cleaned stuff up. But the nurses certainly wouldn't have placed anything in the head. So I tend to think that the surgery on the head area line from the Seibert and O'Neill report would have come from something that occurred either at Bethesda or, as Robbie mentioned, during the missing time frame that we're looking at prior to the autopsy.
When I spoke with William Law, he mentioned talking to Seibert and O'Neill, and he mentioned a few interesting things to me. But one was when he called them, he asked, I think it was O'Neill, no, it might have been Seibert, but he asked one of them if some of the autopsy photos looked like some of the autopsy photos that the public has seen. Like, did the body look like some of the autopsy photos that have been, released? And the guy just said some of them did, some of them didn't, and left it at that. Obviously, they're not going to, specify or go into details or anything like that. But when he explained or asked them the question about the head wound and things of that sort, he talked about that when they pulled the scalp off, the brain just kind of plopped out. Now, I don't know what you guys' stance on when it comes to the brain, but obviously the brain that they had examined or measured and weighed for Kennedy was above average. The normal size of a brain. And some speculation or some detail or discussion has been said that the brain was gray, like it had been soaking in formaldehyde for about 3 weeks. Obviously, this isn't an area that you guys have really dived down into, but obviously it is a giant question when it comes into the question of the brain, because it's been missing since, I think, 64, 60, late 63.
Well, it is an area I've got into quite heavily, really. When you do a craniotomy, you have to lift the brain and cut the brainstem to get the brain out of the head. So it can't just flop onto the table. That doesn't happen.
Connected by nerves and stuff like that.
Unless it's been previously cut, of course. And it was immediately put in a. Well, if you believe the evidence that these people have given, it was put into a bucket of formaldehyde, and then it was perfused by injecting formaldehyde into the cranial arteries. So it usually takes a good few weeks, really, couple of weeks for a brain to set hard enough to do a supplementary autopsy. And there's a big controversy about whether that supplementary autopsy was done within days or within 2 weeks, I think it is, of the brain being set in formaldehyde. Now, I have dissected human brains, and I know the consistency that they are, and I know what it feels like to cut one. So I come with some kind of a background here, but I want to mention something about the object that Brad mentioned being inside the head. I went down that rabbit hole as well to try and figure out what that might be. And I went through catalogs and catalogs of medical equipment to try and find out what looked like a T. I think it's a T in the head. And I came up with there are some neurosurgical clips that are that shape, but unfortunately they're not that size. The nearest I could see about the size of the clip on the photograph, which might be a clip on the photograph, it looks like it's a couple of centimeters at least, whereas neurosurgical clips are very small, much smaller than that. So I went down that rabbit hole, but I couldn't come to any conclusion. And I think the problem is that there's 4 sets of evidence we're trying to reconcile here. So the first set is the photographs. The second set are the X-rays. The third set is the notes that Boswell made. He made a face sheet. And the fourth is the autopsy report itself. Now, ordinarily, all of those 4 things would match. You'd be able to support one of them by the other 3. But you can't do that in this case. They don't mutually support each other. And so it's very difficult to say what's authentic and what's not. And with that, I'll hand over to Brad.
Well, before Brad starts off, that just gives a good preface to this kind of anyone that's listening to this episode that doesn't know anything about Bethesda or anything about the autopsy. The reason why we're kind of, or I'm at least stepping lightly in some of these areas and kind of watching where I step is because it is very controversial what happened at Bethesda. If you Google it up, if you just Google it right now, it's known as the most botched autopsy in history. The Kennedy whole case. It's like the number one thing everyone learns about first. And that's because we really don't know. I mean, what that preliminary draft or everything was burned in Hume's fireplace, which we'll go into a little bit, but that stuff didn't come out until the Assassination Records Review Board. And then we have the photographs, which a lot of people either believe that they're real or they're fake. It's hard to tell and it's hard to understand because you see the statements of doctors that said there was a back wound on Kennedy back of his head, but then you look at back of Kennedy's head, the photograph of it, and you're wondering, why does it look like it's intact? You see the Zapruder film, Kennedy looks like he got shot in the face, so the whole right side of his head should be missing. Then you see a face photograph of Kennedy, and you wonder, okay, what am I seeing here? And then you have to look at the x-rays. Well, if I'm not mistaken, Dr. David Mantic has exposed that there was, fake x-rays, or there was something that wasn't picked up in one of the x-rays that was released into the National Archives. And we have two drawings of the brain that are inside the National Archives, which we can talk about a little later on as well, too. So this whole area is kind of controversial. So it's really specifically looking at examples that we've all come across when looking at Bethesda. I'm sure there'll be others that we'll miss, but there's really examining why this is such a controversial and why it's such an important topic to discuss.
I'm sorry, Russell, please go ahead. I just going back to what Robbie had, and then I do have a question for Russell. You mentioned, Robbie, that Mr. Law had been told by one of the agents that some of the photos were accurate and some of them maybe were not quite as he recalled. On page 115 of the Palomara book, Parkland to Bethesda, O'Neill on September 12th, 1997, stated, "It looks like it's been doctored in some way." Let me rephrase that. When I say doctored, like the stuff has been pushed back in and looks like more towards the end than the beginning, which I take to mean towards the end of the autopsy rather than the beginning. All you have to do was put the flap back over here, and the rest of the stuff is covered up. Quite frankly, I thought there was a larger opening in the back of the head. Specifically, I do not recall those, being cleaned up or fixed in that way. So, yes, the agents did have trouble with photographs. And I was going to ask Russell, if you take a human brain, which, if you'll recall in the autopsy, the human brain weight for John Kennedy was almost bigger than a healthy brain. It certainly did not have any appreciable missing mass, considering people were saying half his brain was blown out. But if you were to take that brain and weigh it, and then place it in formaldehyde to be fixed, how much different would the weight be once the material in the brain has been displaced by the formaldehyde? Is there an appreciable difference between a pre and a post fixed brain?
Oh, not really. If you take a fresh brain and you weigh it, the mass is already there. All of the matter's there, and there's blood in it, so there's liquid in it as well. If you then perfuse the brain with formaldehyde, you're just replacing the blood with formaldehyde, and you're not adding any mass, so you can't make it heavier.
No. I didn't know if the formaldehyde was...
It's another liquid. I don't know what its specific gravity might be compared to blood, but
I think the description of formaldehyde would represent that at the Naval Hospital, they've done cadavers and they've worked on cadavers, which they could have easily replaced Kennedy's brain with another supplemental brain that a lot of people bring up when it comes to the autopsy, which I mean would make a lot of sense. I've heard examinations, and I think there's a couple people, I don't remember if it's Stringer based on his photographs or if it's Sandra Spencer that was working at that little laboratory institute where they were developing photographs, and an agent had came by and told them that they could not speak about it and make sure that they had all the copies of the photographs before he left. I don't know if you guys have ever heard those accounts before, but the brain like was fully intact. Apparently, the Assassination Records Review Board, Jeremy Gunn, did a great job of prodding during that interview to make sure that he got some good examples out of her. And then if we look at the drawing or the sketch, which I believe was sketched off memory or off of what the people were telling the person to sketch, it actually wasn't. That's true, right? That's not misinformation. Make sure. Okay. And I mean, look, that drawing shows a whole right side of that head was completely distorted. So we have a drawing of the brain, which is half of it's distorted and the other half is intact, which would make sense based on the Zapruder film. And then we have statements from witnesses saying, and apparently photographs that have disappeared, that there was a perfectly intact brain. So again, we have the controversy.
You're sort of conflating a few things here. The drawings that you're talking about may be the Rydberg drawings, which were produced for the Warren Commission by Humes and a medical illustrator, and he did do it from the descriptions that were given to him by Humes. But the drawings of the brain, which are in the HSCA volumes, they were copied from photographs by an illustrator, Ida Docks. So she had the photographs to work from. Now, I've never seen the photographs of the brain because I'm not allowed into the National Archives to look at them. But the drawings, they look like there's been a plow going through the right-hand side of the brain. It looks like most of the materials there, which to begin with doesn't look right because, I mean, we know that there were parts of the brain missing from the Parkland doctors saying that parts were dropping onto the cart while they were examining him. And we also know that the wounding to the head cannot just have been on the right side. It must have gone through partially to the left side. From the autopsy descriptions of damage to the mid of the brain and the falx, which is a membrane that runs down the center of the skull, was perforated. So there must have been some wounding to the left, and yet the left looks totally intact. Plus, the cerebellum is intact in the drawings, and the cerebellum was definitely damaged, definitely saw parts of it drop out at Parkland.
Now, could any of this, kind of like you mentioned the Ida Docks drawing, Tim Smith has done really good work on the HSA and exposing some of the Ida Docks stuff. He actually interviewed her, which no one at the time had, and don't think anybody came afterwards. But that was the one piece of work, was those photographs of the brain or the sketching of the brain that she never signed. She signed all her other works. And I forgot who it was, if it was Baden. I think it was Baden. That told her like this is what to draw, and he had a better example of exactly what he said statement wise. That was like, this is what you're going to put down, and she just didn't sign the bottom of it. So obviously, when we talk about the drawings or the false evidence that we can say could be false evidence because it just doesn't match, or maybe it was distorted or put into someone's viewpoint or their perspective. If that was part of the conspiracy, and if that conspiracy was to cover up the actual wounding and the issue of a second shooter, or if it was a factor of they messed up an autopsy, and probably one of the most important autopsies in history, and they're trying to, what the government does do, which is cover your ass. And they're doing the best thing that they possibly can. I bring that up because I still think about the Parkland stuff where you mentioned the Secret Service trying to get the body out of there. It doesn't have to be nefarious, but it could just be a factor of Johnson was not leaving without Jackie, and Jackie was not leaving without her husband. That is a very good point, and it needs to be brought up to have a rational discussion, especially when we talk about something as controversial as the brain issue.
I think you have to stop right away and say, why are drawings necessary? There's never any drawings in any other.
Yeah, we have cameras. Take a photo.
Show us the pictures. Show us the photographs. We don't need an illustrator to draw a photograph. Show us the original.
Brad, you got any comments?
I think that the Warren Commission in 1964, the idea of showing photographs of the insides of a president would have been very objectionable. By the late 70s, the attitudes had changed. It had been some time. The line "too soon" really wouldn't apply. I don't know why they couldn't have released. I mean, I understand why Warren didn't want to release it. It was still too fresh of an injury to the country's psyche. But by 1977, 78, I don't see any reason that they couldn't have released those photographs.
Wait, you see why Warren didn't release them to the public, but what about the fact that he didn't let any other commission members see the photographs either to be able to decipher their own decision?
That is definitely fishy as well. But I don't know. These guys I believe all of them knew President Kennedy, but still their job is to get to the bottom of homicide. So surely they could put those feelings aside. I mean, it's not like they were going to show those photographs and, all these members of the commission burst into tears. I don't know why they weren't allowed to see that. I'm just saying I understand why the photographs weren't included in the hearings initially, but by 15 years later, there's no reason they couldn't have been.
I want to, for lack of a better term, cut into the four pieces of evidence that Russell was mentioning earlier, and I kind of want to go through them a little bit by bit. If we wanted to start off with, obviously, the photographs, we just kind of covered a little bit here. If you guys would just want to mention anything that you feel, your opinion when it comes to anybody that would be looking at these autopsy photographs or any examinations of drawings from the skull, the head, the face, things that were either used in exhibits of the Warren Commission or the HSCA.
Well, let's just say with the photographs, we don't have the originals or anything like the originals. The ones that are in the public domain now are bootleg photographs, several generations removed from the originals. So they're already degraded what we can see. I have a set myself, 10 by 8s. They're not very good. And what I did was I asked some people that had seen the originals at the archives, some doctors, Cyril Wecht and David Mantic, and they've said to me that the copies I have are copies. They are faithful copies of what's in the archives. They're obviously not as good quality, and they've been reframed, some of them. So if they're faithful copies, what I would say about them is they're very poor. They are poorly lit and they're poorly focused, and they don't represent the kind of medical photography that you would expect from an autopsy of the head of state. At least if you're trying to illustrate a point on the body, you would take a kind of a framing shot of the body so you could see whereabouts on the body it is. Then you would take a mid range, and then you would take a close up. So for each thing they're trying to display or illustrate, you would have 3 photographs. That just doesn't exist. That doesn't happen with the Kennedy photographs. And they are also, they're not, they don't properly label the body. So you can't tell. Ordinarily in an autopsy, you would have a label on each photograph present in the photograph so you can see whose autopsy you're referring to, particularly when you've got a mid-range or a close-up shot when you can't see any identifying features of the body. So these things are missing from the photographs, and it leads people to think that they weren't done by a proper medical photographer.
Well, they took out the most identifiable thing about a body, and that's the teeth. Like that's the one thing that can identify. I heard that from Craig Ciccone, but Tim Smith brings up a really good point when you're looking at the back of the head photographs of JFK. He's like, how do you know that's JFK?
Yeah, exactly.
We're not saying it's not, but it's just you look at it and you can't tell. I mean, honestly, definitively, if that is JFK or not. You can kind of see by the hair, but how many people have been mistaken for being Oswald or all these Oswald imposters based on that was the style in like the 60s?
I think the photographs, if you go by what John Stringer had to say, John Stringer was all over the board as far as whether or not those photographs were the photographs that he took. In fact, he would tell a news crew, in one instance, he told the news crew, and this is in the Palomaro book for those who question my citations, but he told the news crew prior to the camera rolling that those were not his photographs. And then as soon as the camera came on, he changed his story again. They were quite upset by that. But I tend to think that, maybe the picture of, there's the picture that shows Kennedy's face intact. That may be accurate. But a lot of that stuff, there's one picture of what appears to be an incised V that is missing out of a temporal area that looks too perfect to be torn. So I really question. I really don't think those photographs are representative at all. I don't know if they were faked or if, as the agents suggested, perhaps some stuff was stretched, scalp was placed in position. I just don't think that they're accurate representation of what the untouched body would have looked like.
And we shouldn't be relying on drawings, like Russell said, for kind of a depiction of what the brain is. And we can't rely on the photographs because they can be messed with or they cannot be accurate, much like the drawings are based on someone that we could believe had some manipulation of it. So all we would need is the brain, and we don't know where the brain is. I think Cyril Weck's the one that talked about it would be real simple if you had the brain. To how they cut it is they like a loaf of bread, you slice it, and then you're able to see the bullet tracks, and this would decipher if a shot came from the front or if a shot came from the back. The one piece of evidence that we would need to end all discussion of where the direction of shots or how many shooters or whatever, it starts with the brain, and that's the one piece of missing evidence. Oh, there's probably multiple, but that's the one crucial, significant, that's widely accepted in all history books, that the brain has just vanished. But the second piece of evidence that we're going to start talking about would be the x-rays. The significance of the x-rays, either if you know a little bit about Mantic's work with finding the little metallic fragment that was in the x-ray, we can go into some of that.
Yeah, we just don't have enough sufficient x-rays, and we have the same problem with the x-rays that we do with the photographs, whether they're authentic or not. I think the ones that I've seen are all cropped, which means they're smaller than the ones that are actually in the National Archives. But I think it is generally accepted that the teeth are available in some of the x-rays, and that means that the x-rays are of Kennedy's head. But whether the wounding to the head is represented in the x-rays or not, I just don't know. David Mantic is he's an expert in x-rays, so you would think he would be the authority here. But he claims that parts of the x-rays have been patched so that you can't see some wounding, and there's particles that have appeared in the x-rays that weren't in them originally. The problem with it all is if you think part of the x-ray has been altered, you can't use other parts of the x-ray to prove your point. If the material is altered, it's not good evidence to use. And the same thing goes with the photographs. So the two things are suspicious, and they're not mutually supportive anyway. The x-rays tend to look like part of the frontal bone is missing, this part of the head, whereas the photographs do not show that wounding.
I would support entirely what Russell said, is that you can't pick and choose your evidence. Like, okay, this corner of the picture is good, but this other corner is bad. Not to criticize anyone's work at all. That's their work, but the two do not line up, as Russell so aptly pointed out. That there's that one, the AP X-ray of the head, and it looks like basically it's missing down almost to the orbit. And that is completely inconsistent with the photograph of the face. And of course, no one in Dallas stated that the face was injured. And even in Bethesda, there's nobody that said there was an injury to the face. So that AP X-ray is really out of left field.
And then obviously we can get into some of the statements from Humes and some of the statements from Fink, and stuff that came out later through the work of the Assassination Records Review Board. I think for me, a lot of things that I came across was that Fink said he made notes. He said that he made notes. He was in the cafeteria. He made up. Someone heard him screaming that someone had swiped his notes. Now, later on, we found out that Dr. James Humes had burned his preliminary draft of his autopsy report in his fireplace. And it was kind of like the Lincoln thing, where he was like, I don't want my blood on my notes to be objects of mere speculation or morbid curiosity, I think was the term they put towards it. But could it have been possible, besides burning his own notes, if he would have burned Fink's? Now, that is a separate question from the main question, which is discussing Humes admitting that he did burn his preliminary draft in his fireplace, and maybe any other things that he would have made in regards to the autopsy, and how we are now going off of what is it material that was based on the rewriting or the remembrance of what they encountered. Was it the night after?
Yeah, I mean,
So
there's so many problems with these notes. I think he burnt Fink's notes. Let's get that clear. I think he burnt
Yes. All right. Thank you.
every note except for the face sheet, which is the drawing of the body, which Boswell noted the wounds on, which you can see in most JFK books. But the problem with the notes is that they should have contained all of the figures and measurements that Humes then went on to use in his autopsy report. So they would have supported the autopsy report. If he'd ever had to go to court with this, he would have had to provide those notes so that they could see that right from the autopsy, where the notes was written down contemporaneously, made it into the autopsy report. And the fact that he can't do that now, or of course he's dead now, but the fact that he couldn't do that when the Warren Commission was around means that it's very suspicious that the measurements in the autopsy report, he could have just made them up. And I think he did make a lot of it up. When he left the autopsy room, he left with 3 wounds: a wound in the back of JFK's back, a small wound, according to him, in the occiput, and then a large wound in the parietal temporal occipital area. So 3 wounds. He didn't even know about the throat wound. So it wasn't until later when he found out about the throat wound. Now he's got a problem because he's got an entry in the back, looks like an entry in the back, could be an exit, he doesn't know. He's got an entry what he thinks in the head, and he's got an exit here, and now he's got another entry here, and he's got no bullets. So now he's got to make it up. The body's gone, and all he has is these descriptions of the wounds to go with. So he puts together a story that kind of hangs together, perhaps in his own mind, that there was a wound, went into the back and came out the throat rather than the other way around. And the wounding in the head, completely made up as well, as far as I can tell. So the notes are critical.
Now, why do you think he did that? Because obviously, I think it was alluded to in the HSCA, but they just never bothered asking any more questions or prodding into the kind of alluding to him burning his notes and things of that sort. It came out during the Assassination Records Review Board, from the questioning of Jeremy Gunn.
Yes, that's right. I mean, at the HSCA questioning of Humes and Boswell was it was controlled. So the panel of forensic pathologists that looked at their materials and then interviewed those 2 doctors were split in half. 3 of them, including Cyril Weck, never spoke to Humes and Boswell, and the part of the team that did speak to them were completely wedded to the government's view of the wounding. So they didn't ask them any really penetrating questions, which Cyril Wecht certainly would have done. And it wasn't until we came to the ARRB that any more pertinent questions were asked, really. And that wasn't by a forensic pathologist or a panel of forensic pathologists. It was Jeremy Gunn. He did a very good job, but we just don't have the expertise to be able to say that the ARRB materials trump anything else, really.
Do you
They
think
decided not to have a forensic pathology panel.
Do you think the HSCA purpose or someone purposely did that because they knew Wecht would ask certain questions that might have opened up or alluded to certain information? Because when I spoke with Tunheim and Tom Samolick of the Assassination Records Review Board when we did a group episode on the Assassination Records Review Board, none of them knew that they could do what Jeremy Gunn did with the interview stuff. It wasn't until later on, more towards the ARB's kind of conclusions, towards 98, that they realized that there could have been this area of not interrogation, but interviewed questions that they could have been doing. A lot of it was that their initial start was about just releasing files or finding out what could be released and hunting down documents and things of that sort. So I don't think like the ARB was influenced at all. I think it was just meant to burn out, basically, like a candle. And I think that's why we have some very crucial information, was because nobody expected that style of questioning or that style of interviewing to happen that we got with Sandra Spencer and others.
Absolutely. Cyril Wecht was definitely kept away from it. I've spoken to him about it when he was alive, God bless him. And he was still furious about it.
Yeah, Wecht would have definitely, if nothing else, he could have prepped the people doing the questioning, is that you must ask this, you must ask that. And you know how Wecht spoke, everything was emphatic. You know, this is absolutely critical that we find this out and that out. And even though I think for being layman, the ARB staff did a decent job, it's not the same as being interviewed by a man who's done thousands and thousands of traumatic autopsies.
What do you think about the statements of Humes, Brad?
Humes, you know, I think it came after I spoke to him. I pretty much just dismiss whatever he has to say. Uh, you know, my contact with Humes was almost laughable. I'd try to ask a question and he'd steer it in some direction. He'd end up talking about conferences and how stupid they were and this, that, and the other, to where I just really, there were times when I spoke to him in 1992, I wondered if he had the onset of dementia. And I don't mean to be cruel with that. I mean, no disrespect to the family. But he just, he wasn't tracking. So his statements, I tend to just dismiss.
Now, did you ask him or did you know about any of the information when it came to him burning his draft at the time you interviewed him or anything like that?
No, that was not something of which I was aware. I was pretty new to the case at that point. But I spoke to him in the wake of the JAMA article on May 27, 1992. The Journal of the American Medical Association issued a magazine article with two articles, one on Parkland and one on the autopsy. And, you know, Humes came off very focused in that interview, which is what I expected. I don't know what the distance was. You know, it may not have been dementia so much as him trying to just steer me off the course of where I was going. But I know that if I'd have asked him about that, he would have ended up talking about circuses or something.
Now, Russell, you mentioned about not noticing the throat wound or the entry wound, but when you mentioned about the back wound, now, do you guys know if someone had stopped them from prodding into the back wound at Bethesda? There's been this kind of like, I mean, we've talked about it already and hinted to it already about alluding to a direction or someone that was controlling the autopsy. But looking at Berkeley's kind of whole role in a lot of the autopsy stuff and a lot of what was going on with the body of President Kennedy, I don't know if it was Curtis LeMay, but I think Oliver Stone depicts it in his movie. But I more believe that it was Berkeley. I mean, I know Berkeley wasn't necessarily present, but I know people were running down the hallway and trying to speak with Berkeley about certain things that were going to be performed and be done. And Berkeley was giving orders of not to do certain things in regards to privacy of the Kennedy family, which again, when we talk about the conspiracy, the Kennedys have as much to answer as anybody in the government does as well, too. There should have been certain things that could have easily ended certain discussions or certain rumors or certain conspiracy theories in regards to access to the archive material. I mean, you're limiting that to very certain individuals that get the proper say from the Kennedy family. And look, I understand they've been through a lot, but there was a lot of things. Robert Kennedy should have been interviewed by the Warren Commission. I get he was going through a hard time, but there was a lot of things now that we're dealing with that needs answers to, and we just don't have answers because certain things were levied for the family, certain things like Earl Warren did, where he just interviewed Jackie Kennedy privately. I mean, now at this point, 60 years on, you kind of have to criticize the government, criticize the Kennedy family, criticize everything where you're really examining into why this is so distorted 60 years on.
Well, there's a lot in that question, yeah. With the back wound, I think that there was no direction given to them what they should do. I mean, Hume stuck his finger into it, which is a very strange thing to do if you want
to
preserve a wound. Yeah, I was going to say stupid, but I don't like to talk ill of the dead. But he stuck his finger into it and said he could feel the end of it. And there was some talk of some probing with some malleable probes that could find a path. There's no photographs of that, and I've only heard some talk about it. But they claim that they could see the probe pushing into the pleura, which is in the inside of the chest, and not making a hole. So that back wound is a bit of a mystery, really. I have no idea whether it was an entry or what it was, because the autopsy was too poor to really know. As far as the neck wound goes, well, the guys at Parkland, anybody who saw it before it had been altered with a tracheostomy incision, all said that it looked like, to them, more like an entry wound than an exit wound. It was small and round and got fairly well-defined edges. But of course, it wasn't recognized at Parkland, and Galloway didn't pipe up and say, "Hey, did you know there was a wound in the throat?" So they didn't bother doing the proper procedures which they should have done to dissect all of the organs in the neck. It's a mystery to me why they didn't do that, because they should have done. It's in their technical manual that tells them to do that, tells them exactly what to do, and they should have been taking organs out and weighing them, but they didn't. And then finally, by connecting the two wounds after the body had gone, we've got another controversy which I don't think has been brought out in the existing books very much. It's certainly in one of my books, but probably didn't sell as well as some others. That in Parkland they thought there may have been a pneumothorax, which would be a hole in the lining of the lung, which means the lung collapses, and you'll know that they inserted chest tubes to relieve the pressure so that the breathing would be more effective. So if you suspect there's been a pneumothorax, and Hume should have done because there were incisions in the right place to put tubes in the chest, he should have tested for pneumothorax. Now, either he did the test and it showed there was a pneumothorax and he ignored it, because he has to, for this wound to go from the back through the neck, it's higher than the lung. So he has to ignore it if there was a pneumothorax. He either did it and ignored it, or he just didn't do it. Both things are negligent.
To me, I've always been struck by the fact that none of the physicians who were there, or none of the military brass even, that were in the emergency room at Parkland, ever piped up during the autopsy and said, "Oh, hey, there was a bullet hole there, and what you're seeing, I'm not a doctor, but the doctor that was there sliced through it. I don't know why they waited until the next morning. That to me is absolutely laughable that they waited until the following morning. This is important enough that if you have a question, you need to call and wake Malcolm Perry up in the middle of the night. Why wasn't that brought to their attention ahead of time? Because we have 3 Secret Service agents who were in the motorcade, 2 of them in the car, that were there at the autopsy. You've got McHugh, you've got Berkeley, who I believe was in and out of that autopsy room throughout the course of the whole thing. I'm sorry?
Yeah, I keep saying Galloway. It was Berkeley, wasn't it?
Yes. But
I'm not good with
that.
Wait, so you're saying that it wasn't Galloway the whole time, it was Berkeley?
Yeah, it was Admiral Berkeley, wasn't it?
Brad, he's asking you because we've been mentioning Galloway this whole time, so it'd be good to clarify if it was Galloway or Berkeley.
Yes, I believe it was Berkeley. And as Russell's indicating, apparently he thinks so as well. But as far as the neck, JAMA in 92 did confirm, and Dr. Boswell confirmed with me on the telephone, that they did examine what was left of the adrenal glands. They really found nothing with adrenals, confirming he had Addison's disease. So there was more to this than just the gunshot element. That there must have been something from the family that said, would you check him for Addison's? Because we did have a diagnosis of Addison's, which was kept secret. He would not have survived a second term due to the Addison's disease. But Addison's breaks down the adrenals, and they really found nothing but just little, as I recall, the wording that he used were bits of adrenal gland left, which they're non-functioning essentially.
What about Malcolm Perry's placement in all of this? Whether he made a statement or whether he was interviewed or whether he had anything that alluded to something that you guys might have come across. I always found it really weird, but do you guys remember Eddie Barker from, I think it was WFAA or WBAP radio or KRLD, I think it is actually. But he was at the International Trade Mart. So he's one of the actual very first people that actually broadcasted technically that Kennedy was dead. I know everyone attributes it to Walter Cronkite, but that's not actually true. He did make the most public announcement because I think his station had the most viewership at the time. But he's at the International Trade Mart. You can watch the 35-minute interview on YouTube. Don't worry, this all ties together. He says he has 3 reports, 2 of them that he cannot confirm. One is that President Kennedy is dead. He could not confirm that report. He says it on air. 2 is that Governor Connolly's in surgery, cannot confirm that. And 3, that an FBI agent has been shot and killed in the line of duty. That he confirmed as being a truthful report. He says that in the 35-minute thing. But then towards the ending, or a person that would rather remain unidentified was at, I don't remember if it was Parkland Hospital. He said Parkland Hospital, but it was Malcolm Perry. I don't know if you've ever heard that before, but states that the president was dead. That is in the thing. They don't identify him, but I have a clip up on it on my YouTube. But yeah, so yeah, I didn't know if you guys ever came across. I don't know what his involvement, where he was located or what he was doing, but apparently that's the unidentified person that was talking about that had the medical information. I don't know whether he was at Parkland or received that information, but he was there at the Trade Mart. So
what time would that have been that he aired that?
I don't know for sure.
Because the first instance that I'm aware, now Russell may have different information or better information, The first instance that I know that Malcolm Perry made any type of public statement or spoke to any reporter was the White House transcript 1327C.
1 p.m. CST on November 22nd, 1963, shortly after President Kennedy had been shot. Comes
Okay, that
from
was well before the
KRLD TV.
that was well before the Parkland press conference with Kemp Clark and Malcolm Perry.
Because
So
Malcolm Perry's at the conference where Malcolm, not Malcolm, yeah, it's Malcolm Kilduff, makes that statement. I don't know if he was there at that moment, but there is photos of him at Parkland Hospital. So I know he was there at a point. I just don't know if he was there when the announcement, but that information to Eddie Barker came from Malcolm Perry. That was later identified. Eddie Barker said that later in an interview, but at the time he asked him, you could hear it because the footage is just rolling and they're just talking. And he's filming all the people at the International Trade Mart crowd. And he asks, well, we have a confirmed report the president is dead, and we got this confirmed report. And the guy said, no, I don't want my name on there. So that person was Malcolm Perry. So I'm interested in what his involvement in the autopsy, if you guys came across anything. Sorry, I didn't want to, I just thought it was an interesting aside with Malcolm Perry.
Russell?
Well, Perry, it's really unknown still. At some point, Humes called the hospital and asked to speak to Perry, and was told that there'd been a tracheostomy incision. But there's still some question about whether that was during the autopsy or after the autopsy, and you'll hear various reports at the timing of that phone call. The one thing we can be sure about is that Humes didn't have the body in front of him to check.
And that's something that I've always heard that it was the following morning. I believe it was Jim Carrico was in the room when the call came in, and only hearing the Perry side of things, he was well aware that at Bethesda they were unaware that there had been a throat injury, and the impression that Carrico seemed to have was, how did they miss that? Because simply if you'd have inserted a probe into the back wound, theoretically, according to the Warren Commission, it should have emerged from the throat. But I tend to think that pneumothorax that you mentioned came from a shot to the throat that was an entry, and it was going down and to the left, and it would have just clipped the top of the left lung. But Perry, I don't believe was contacted during the autopsy itself.
And what about Pierre Fink?
What about him?
Well, what's his statements, obviously, that came through, whether it was being interviewed by the HSCA, Warren Commission, anything. I mean, obviously, he arrived later. I don't think that the Warren Commission or HSCA bothered asking Humes or anything what happened before Fink arrived. So I'm guessing a lot of the autopsy takes place with all three of them there. But all three of them at some point had to reach a conclusion that's fit along the same basis, whether testimony was taken out or whether they just weren't asked certain questions that might have derived different statements. We only have statements from other people that Fink talked about notes. And I think maybe Fink might have stated at one point he made notes, but he never mentions it again. I had come across that through documentation. That's how I know that he was in the cafeteria screaming about his notes, but he was never really interrogated about certain instances of that. So we don't really have an answer to if it possible Humes could have. I like to think he did, because if he burned one set, what stops him from burning the rest? But
Well, I mean, Fink was never asked about his notes by any official investigation, so none of it's official. It's kind of hearsay evidence. You would never know that he arrived too late to actually apply his expertise from his statements, his official statements either. And all he did was he totally stuck to the line that the autopsy report, as written by Humes, is what they saw and what they were going to go with from then on. They would never deviate from that, if you like. The only thing that actually people got something out of him was the trial of Clay Shaw, of course, when he was asked why they didn't dissect the wound in the neck, and he just kept repeating that he was, well, eventually he said he was ordered not to, but he couldn't remember who by. And I think I've got that right, Brad, haven't I?
I believe so, yes. And the JAMA article, May 27 of 92, that omitted Fink. They only spoke with Humes and Boswell, and that prompted some letters from some readers saying, hey, what's the deal? Why didn't you interview Fink? So they did a special. They tracked him down to, I believe it was Geneva, Switzerland, that he was living in. And they interviewed him. And just the sense that I got, and maybe it's just me, the sense that I have in reading what he had to say, there was definitely a divisive line between Fink and Humes and Boswell. That there were some hard feelings of some kind, or there was some tension. Maybe it was something as simple as a slight disagreement over whether a procedure should have been done. I don't know, but they were not all on the same page, and that may have stemmed from the burning of the notes, and perhaps the fact that I'm sure at some point he became aware, probably when he walked in the door, that they'd already been working on the body prior to his arrival, and he's going, well, now wait a second, I'm supposed to see this thing in a pristine condition, and you've already started it. But there was definitely a line between those two pathologists and Dr. Fink.
Well, I know between Boswell and Humes, there was discussion that was revealed by the Assassination Records Review Board, not about notes, but just about rewriting notes, and having a discussion about what went on during the autopsy briefly, which makes me wonder how long that relationship was. Whether, I mean, I know they were there before Fink arrived, but Fink seems to be the outside force here that's kind of being brought in. So I'm just wondering how close of a relationship, and is it possible that at some point, it is speculation, but they could have been like, we need to get our statements in line so we're on the same page here. Because if Fink comes out as an outside force or outside testimony, they'll just disregard Fink's. They already got two confirmed.
But I think Brad's absolutely right. And there was a reading between the lines, there was a division between Fink and the other two. And I mean, if you think about it, he's an army guy. He's been asked to come to a naval hospital as a consultant, and they wouldn't let him in. The Marines wouldn't let him in. Took him hell of a time to get into the autopsy. He gets in there, and Boswell and Humes are standing with their hands on their hips with a body that's been cut up in front of him, and he's being asked to sign the autopsy report or put his name to it at least. And I mean, none of us would want to do that. And when you can't apply your expertise, be asked to sign off, if you like, on an autopsy report which you can't possibly know is true. So I think that's where it stems from.
Can I ask about what time Fink arrived? You mentioned the 9:15 or 9:15. Has there been different answers? Because I thought Fink gave a different statement later on that he said didn't arrive much later.
Yeah, I mean, there was always some speculation about it up to the Warren report and the HSCA about exactly what time he arrived. Now, they knew it was after the start of the autopsy, which started at 8, because they didn't even call him till around that time. But it wasn't until the JAMA articles that it was revealed that he arrived about 9:15.
Because I'm wondering why, because I think I've read a statement from him that said it was like 35 minutes or 40 minutes later. And I'm like, if
they want to minimize it.
Yeah, so I'm wondering how manipulated he was in it, because I like to think of Fink as like he probably revealed a little bit more about some of the stuff that went on there, just because he wasn't maybe talked to or wasn't as in the clique of whatever Boswell and Thornton or Boswell and Humes were. So I just thought I'd bring that up. But one thing I wanted to get done that we never talked about yet in the beginning of this was what that should have been done, the procedures that should have gone on that you have in that supplemental report, that are how normal procedures are done when dealing with an autopsy, because we kind of discussed what went on at Bethesda, what should have been done now.
Yeah, well, thanks for bringing that up, Robbie, because it does let me show you some of this book that I have, which is the Tri-Service Autopsy Manual. This is the autopsy manual that the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force should follow when they do an autopsy on a body. And this existed at the time. This copy is from 1983, but it certainly existed at the time. And Humes had a copy in his office. He was asked about it by the ARRB, whether he'd followed it, and he said he didn't even know it existed. But of course, everybody who worked in pathology in the armed services would have had a copy. And there's lots in here. It was first really gone through by Harold Weisberg, who mentions it in some of his books.
Good old pack rat. I love that guy.
He's a good guy, isn't he? Yeah, I went through it, and there's lots in here that's very interesting.
It's funny we like him later on because every researcher at the time basically hated Weisberg.
Yeah, yeah. One of the most interesting things about this manual is it has a specific section on a forensic pathology, a specific section on what you should do if your autopsy is a forensic autopsy. So if Humes and Boswell didn't know what they should do, they had a book in their office, or certainly there would have been this book around somewhere that they could have grabbed and had a look to remind themselves. As they'd been driving a desk for several years, perhaps they did need that reminder, and they could have followed this book, just like I did, to create a table that shows what they should have done compared to what they actually did. It's very revealing. It's a difficult book to get hold of. I accept that. So if you want to see my conclusions, they're in this book, which was published by Dealey Plaza UK for the 50th anniversary, 2013. And my chapter on the autopsy is in this book, and it reveals some of the things that I found. I think this book's still available on Amazon. You can probably pick up, not too expensive. So that's my plug for a book and a manual. And I'll pass over to Brad.
I don't have much to add other than I'm quite envious that I don't have a copy of that manual. I'm going to have to track that down.
When it comes to access of that manual, what would be the excuse not to look at it? Obviously, you would bring up the reasoning of having a hasty autopsy. If they're being pressured to perform, then maybe that would make sense of why they didn't check it. But the whole point of going to Bethesda was to have a thorough autopsy done. So then that would be, why would there be pressure exerted in that instance? And that's when you have to start wondering about suspects of who would apply pressure or who would be the orchestrating forces. Have you guys ever came to a conclusion or thoughts on an individual? Obviously, I would think Berkeley has a large involvement. I think I mentioned about the Kennedy family privacy issues, I think played a major role. I know of at least 2 skull fragments that man has that have never been submitted into evidence. So that's a big, giant problem right there. But do you guys have any suspects, or do you think Berkeley is just the one that you've largely considered?
I can't comment. I think they're all involved.
Okay. I'm with you. I mean, how do
There
we
was
know,
enough
right?
brass. There
Some
was enough
at least
brass in
one,
that
at least
room.
one, at least one person was definitely involved. So saying all of them is not bad at all.
No, it covers all the bases, right?
Yeah.
But Brad's probably more into this aspect than I am.
I Berkeley, of course, had his finger in every aspect of everything. But you know, you mentioned earlier Curtis LeMay, and LeMay was certainly there. And as I recall, there was an incident where Humes wanted LeMay's cigar extinguished, and LeMay blew smoke in the face of whoever the courier was that conveyed that message to him. LeMay hated John Kennedy, made it very clear to everybody, including to John Kennedy. And I'm sure that if the gentleman did a tremendous amount as far as national security and developing a SAC, but he was actually quite a despicable individual. He certainly could have been in the middle of this as well.
When it comes to wounds are obviously another example of evidence if we looked at them, but they were so distorted they probably wouldn't be able to tell us just an accurate depiction of either the primary entries or what the primary wounds were before they became distorted at Bethesda Hospital. I'm curious on your guys' thoughts about other existing pieces of evidence. When I say that, I mean things like the Harper fragment, things that were found later, or pieces of skull. Obviously, I have like 4 different instances from like a WFAA reporter, Walter Evans, that said in an interview at 7:30 p.m. a guy had ran up to him and an officer with holding a piece of skull fragment with a little piece of flesh on it. Then you have on the C-130 plane where the vehicle's being flown back, a piece of skull fragment found. I think Vince Palomar documents that. You have a lot of pieces that are missing from Kennedy's body. The Harper fragment was, I think me and Russell have discussed at a point, was found by a child who gave it to his father, who took it to some person at a medical institute. And next thing you know, that skull fragment, all we have is pictures of it. So I'm wondering if you guys have any thoughts on existing pieces of evidence or evidence that went missing, that would help piece together a little bit more about the autopsy because right now we've discussed 4 pieces and none of them we can use as good evidence. So again, it's why it remains controversial.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the problem. I mean, the pieces of skull would be great if we either had the actual pieces or we had verifiable photographs of them or X-rays of them. And actually, all we've got are photographs of the Harper fragment and X-rays of the other fragments that you mentioned. And yet, the HSCA panel spent a long time spinning their wheels trying to fit those parts of the skull into what they thought was a hole in Kennedy's head. A total waste of time, because the fragments are not identified. We don't know from where they came on the skull. The X-rays are suspect. The photographs are suspect. So why are they trying to put this jigsaw puzzle together? Was pointless. That is one of the problems with the whole case, is that I can't think of a single piece of evidence that's not compromised in some way. Perhaps Brad could come up with one. There's a challenge.
No, a challenge that I can't meet. No, I always felt that the failure to close Elm Street after the shooting was a tremendous failing by the Dallas Police Department. I mean, obviously, you've got the rest of the motorcade that you're not going to be able to get stopped, but there's going to be bone, there's going to be brain, there's going to be possibly bullet fragments, there's going to be all kinds of stuff in the street that should have been collected. And I know that those 2 fragments that were delivered to the autopsy room did account for, I believe, about 2/3 of the missing bit of skull, at least allegedly. I tend to doubt.
2/3 of it.
It's been a long time since I looked at that, but I believe so that it did cover a significant portion.
But how many fragments are we talking about? Because, like I said, we just mentioned the Harper fragment that was never brought into Parkland, and then Walter Evans' fragment was never brought into Parkland, and neither was the one on the C-130. So that's 3 fragments.
I believe there were 2 that were delivered by the FBI, but again, I've been doing this a long time, so there may be an error there. But regardless, there are still there's a very good chance that you've got biological evidence that is left in the street, which what's going to happen? It's going to get driven over and it's going to get pulverized. So any metallic fragments that are embedded in that bone, any bullet fragments that are in the street are going to be picked up in tires. I mean, they lost a tremendous opportunity to recover evidence by not closing that street.
Hey, Robbie, I'd like to show you a demonstration that I often do when I'm talking about JFK, and I do quite a few talks over here in England, and that is to just get a normal piece of writing paper. We call it A4. I think you call it letter paper. And if you just fold it into four, so you fold it in half once, and you fold it in half again, so you get a piece about this size. That is roughly the dimensions of the hole that they said was in JFK's head in Bethesda. This was described as missing, 13 centimeters missing in the top of the head. If you get this template and you put it on your head, it gives you an idea of how much was missing when he got to Bethesda. Now, this is a huge amount of missing bone and scalp. Certainly wasn't what they saw at Parkland. And that's a very simple demonstration to do to show you how different the wounds were at Parkland and Bethesda.
What about, I'm curious because I know Humes was interviewed in 78 by the HSCA, and one question did get brought up to him, which was, why does the hair look wet in the photographs? Obviously, when you look at the autopsy and you want to get a good examination, you can look at the drawings, but the photographs are what people are going to be attracted to. Because it shows them exactly. I can see with my eyes this. It's like how we use the Zapruder film to tell how many shots, even though it's a silent film, which makes no sense. So you're just looking at the angles or the faces that Connolly and Kennedy make to depict when they got shot by what they got shot with. But when you look at the photograph of the back of Kennedy's head, and it's all wet back there, what do you explain that to be? I mean, obviously, you look at the photographs, you don't see skull missing. I don't see skull missing. I don't know what. All I see is a fucking throat wound in any of those photos. So I don't. I mean, what would you say? I mean, some people bring up that when Kennedy's, what is it, his funeral, burying him in a casket, they cleaned him up pretty well. I'm like, yeah, but how do you re-put brain material and all that back in there to the point where it looks like he's intact enough, unless you had to really cosmetically do something to dress him up in that fashion?
And if you did that, they're not autopsy photographs. They're photographs for a completely separate region.
Memoriams.
I think at the back of the head, one of the problems with that photograph is that more to the top of the head, the hair's wet, but at the back of the head where the autopsy surgeon said there was a wound, it's dry. So the difference between wet and dry there, and it looks like to some people that the photographs have been altered and this piece has been added in. And if you've got this much missing on the skull, you've got to add some bits in to make a photograph that looks anything like the extant ones we've got.
Well, it would match the Zapruder film when you watch it, and there's that black square behind Kennedy's head after he gets shot. I know everyone says, oh, you can't tell if that's a distortion of the film, but I'm like, dude, that's dead exactly where everyone is describing that there's a back wound in the back of his head. And it's not on any other part of the film. It's just that one part.
Well, you know how much the Zapruder film divides JFK researchers.
Yeah, that's why I mentioned
yeah.
You either buy into it totally and say it's 100% authentic, and then you can use it to prove your case, or you don't buy into it and you say it's falsified, and you can use that to prove your case. And who knows? Who knows whether the Zapruder film is real or not? I try to avoid using it in any of my articles or books because I'm just not an expert in that area. I cannot say whether it's real or not, or whether it's been altered, or to what degree it's been altered. And I hear you all agreeing with me that you either go one way or the other. But I'm sorry, I just have to sit on the fence and say I just don't know.
That's a good point. That again, that is an area where people cherry pick things. That sometimes they'll say, "Well, it's fake," but if you look at this one frame, it proves my point. As far as the hair, the only thing, and I don't know that this makes sense because I don't have that manual that Russell has, but the only thing that I can think of is possibly if they attempted to clean maybe some blood clotting out of the hair in different places to get a shot of the alleged entry wound. The entry wound, which of course was moved 4 years later, or 4 inches a number of years later. But that would be the only reason that I could think of the hair being wet. And at that point, you would hope that they took pictures of the original condition before we start scrubbing the president's hair looking for injuries. But that would be the only reason that I could think of.
You can go onto the internet and you can find other autopsy reports and you can find autopsy pictures. I've got several books on gunshot wounds showing autopsy pictures. And when they want to photograph an entry wound, they part the hair and make sure you can see the wound before they photograph it. And you can't see a wound on JFK's autopsy photographs. I don't think, anyway.
No.
But I don't think they're real. So who knows?
Yeah.
Well, with so much of this stuff being kind of controversial, we've already mentioned the Zapruder film's controversy, but when it comes to the Bethesda Medical Hospital, why would you guys say it would be even important to even look at the Bethesda autopsy in general if you're going to look into the assassination? Obviously, they have clear red flags. I think we can all agree. But when it comes to a concise answer or conclusion on it, a lot of these forensic terms get dodged over people's heads. It gets dodged over mine. It's very hard for people to understand. So they technically, a doctor comes on and tells people this is what happened. They're going to accept it and not look into it because people don't have the medical degrees. But when it comes to the importance of even looking at Bethesda in support of research and sparking up interest into the assassination, do you guys have any strong points on that? Or do you guys think it's just an area that's like the Zapruder film? It's interesting to look at, but it's got a lot of things that necessarily don't have answers to it.
I mean, with the important thing about Bethesda is how different the wounds are when they're described by the autopsy doctors to the ones that were described by the trauma team in Parkland. And the real challenge is to come up with a reason why that should be so. And I don't profess to have the answer, but you can't really get into the medical evidence without equipping yourself with a bit of background. You have to get a model of the skull or some pictures of the skull bones and really familiarize yourself with where the different bones are and therefore which bones are being talked about by the different sets of doctors. You just have to invest a bit of effort into it, just the same as you would if you wanted to start looking at the authenticity of the films. You'd have to know about how films are made and how they're processed and the different places that they may have been processed. So it's just one of those areas where a lot of people avoid it because it is so technical. But I think you can pick up quite a few different books which give you a good background. And I think you may not agree with Lifton's point of view, David Lifton in Best Evidence. I don't necessarily agree with him or disagree with him, but it's a good synopsis of the different woundings that you can begin to understand the problem. And probably Gerald McKnight's book is a good one to look at. Obviously, I would recommend my own books. I try very hard to describe the wounds in layman's terms, or at least if I use medical terms to explain those terms. But I think you simply have to get into it to some degree.
You know, when I was 15, I read the Warren Report, which, you know, everybody knows how big it is. It's 888 pages, which is quite a daunting task. But in order to believe, this was the very first book that I read on Kennedy. But in order to even follow what the commission's talking about, you must go along with the idea that Oswald was the shooter, which is what they're trying to convince you of in that 888 pages. So in order to understand their theory that Oswald was in the window and all that, that obviously has to be backed up by something. So the autopsy, and they do a pretty good job in that report of breaking down the medical terminology, even though, as we've been discussing, it's all when you get beneath the surface, it's all very suspect. But in order to just understand even the case against Oswald, you need to understand the autopsy report. Then of course, as we have all done, you look beyond that and you see that there's layers to this onion that need to be peeled back, and you come to completely different ideas. But in order to understand it at all, you have to understand the autopsy.
Briefly, before we hit that 2-hour mark, do you guys mind promoting your links? Russell, you can go first, and then Brad will end with you.
Yeah, sure. The best place to find me is on Instagram, Russell_Kent_author, and all my links are on there. And I try to post something every week or so, either on the assassination or on my new research interest, which is war crimes trials.
Mine, JFK Lancer offers my book, First on the Scene, as a CD-ROM, which I recommend not for my book, but because it comes with a video of 90 minutes of Ron Jones talking, which is worth the price of admission right there. But you can also get a Kindle version on Amazon for not too much. I don't recall what it is exactly. And I'm not a big Instagram person. I'm on Facebook, of course. And you will know me because I'm the one with the picture of the book cover as my cover photo.
Gentlemen, I appreciate the time you gave me to talk about Bethesda on this episode. Appreciate the time you gave me on past episodes as well, too. I'm going to link all your links in the description. Thank you, everybody, for listening to this episode of Out of the Blanket. Stay tuned for our next episode.